My name is Denise Callahan, and for 51 of my 53 years, I believed I was standing on the only ground in the universe that would survive what was coming. I believed that everyone outside my faith, my neighbors, my coworkers, even my own sister, was already, in some spiritual sense, dead. I did not believe this the way you believe a fact you read in a book. I believed it the way you believe the sun will rise. It was underneath everything. I gave that belief my Saturday mornings for 4 decades, walking door to door with a canvas bag of magazines, rehearsing what to say if someone slammed the door in my face. Because someone always did, and I had been taught that their anger was proof I was doing something right. I gave it my son's wedding, which I did not attend, because he had married a woman who was not one of us, and the elders had made it very clear what attending would cost me. I gave it my mother's last conscious hour in a hospital room in Salem, where a document she had signed years earlier prevented doctors from doing the one thing that might have kept her breathing a little longer. I would have told you, if you had asked me at 50, that I would die a Jehovah's Witness. I would have told you it without hesitation. The way you state your own name, I was wrong, and the way I found out I was wrong did not come from a stranger, a critic, or an apostate pamphlet left on a windshield. It came from inside my own hallway, from a laptop screen my 17-year-old grandson forgot to close, and from 4 words typed by a lawyer in a country I had never visited. This is the story of how the floor I had stood on my entire life turned out to be a stage. Before I take you into it, I want to say something to whoever is watching this right now, wherever you are. Some of you found this video because you grew up the way I did inside a congregation, inside a kingdom hall, inside a family where the meetings on Sunday and Thursday were not optional, they were oxygen. Some of you are still inside, watching this on a phone, with the volume low, maybe in a bathroom, maybe in a car, in a parking lot, because you already have questions you are afraid to say out loud. And some of you have never set foot near this world at all, and you are simply curious how a 53-year-old grandmother ends up rebuilding her entire life from scratch in her 50s. Whoever you are, I am glad you are here. And I promise you this story is true to how I lived it, even where names and small details have been changed to protect the people still inside. If this is the kind of story that means something to you, if you have your own version of a door that finally opened after decades of being told it was locked for your own good, I would ask you to hit subscribe before you go any further, because I am going to be telling more stories like this one. And I do not want you to lose this channel in the algorithm the way I once lost so many years. Take a moment and like this video too. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need to hear it. Sometimes people sitting in a Kingdom Hall parking lot right now, scrolling exactly like you are. And I would love to know where you are watching from tonight. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I have heard from women in Manchester, in Adelaide, in Ohio, in Ontario, in Cape Town, all of them telling me some version of what I am about to tell you. I read every comment. It matters to me to know how far this reaches, because for most of my life I believed the world outside my faith was small, hostile, and temporary. It turns out the world is enormous, and it has been waiting for me the entire time. So let me start at the beginning, not with the day I left, but with the day, 4 months earlier, that I first let myself doubt. I was born into this. That distinction matters, because there is a particular kind of certainty that only exists in people who never had to choose their beliefs. They simply woke up inside them, the way you wake up inside a language. My mother was baptized in 1968, in a rented hall in Salem that the congregation used before they built the Kingdom Hall on Liberty Street. By the time I was born, in 1973, there was no version of my future that did not include field service, no version of Christmas that included a tree, no version of my birthday that included a cake with candles, because birthdays, I was taught before I could read, were pagan and displeasing to Jehovah. I was baptized at 15, in a rented hotel pool at a district convention in Seattle, wearing a borrowed white t-shirt over my swimsuit because the elders had reminded the sisters, again, to dress modestly for immersion. I remember the water was colder than I expected. I remember my mother crying in the stands. I remember believing, with my whole chest, that I had just guaranteed myself a place in the new system of things, a paradise earth where I would never grow old, never bury anyone I loved, never again feel the specific ache of watching someone leave a room and wonder if they were leaving for good. I want you to understand that I was not naive. I was not uneducated. I read constantly, the Watchtower, the Awake, the yearbooks, the biographies of missionaries who had given up everything. I could defend my faith in a doorway conversation better than most people can defend a doctoral thesis. I had answers for every objection because the organization trained us for every objection. What I did not have, what none of us were given, was the tool to ask our own questions. Questioning was not treated as intellectual honesty. It was treated as a symptom, something Jehovah's organization referred to, gently but unmistakably, as weak faith, or, worse, the influence of the world. I married Frank Callahan when I was 22. He was a ministerial servant then, an elder within 6 years. A man whose voice from the platform on Sunday mornings could make the whole hall go still. We raised 2 children, Trevor and a daughter I will call Marissa in this story, both of them dedicated and baptized young. Both of them taught, as I had been, that the education system was a trap designed to fill their heads with worldly philosophy. That higher education was, in the words of one convention speaker I still remember almost word for word, a mortgage on time you do not have, because the end is very, very near. I pioneered for 11 years, which meant 90 hours a month, minimum, of formal preaching activity, tracked and reported to the congregation secretary at the end of every month on a small printed card. I remember the quiet competitive pride of turning in a high hour count. I remember the shame of a low one, and inventing small justifications for it before anyone even asked. I remember believing that the numbers on that card were a kind of spiritual scoreboard between me and God Himself, and that if I stopped keeping score, I would be the one who lost. For most of my life, none of this felt like sacrifice. It felt like devotion. That is the part people outside this world struggle to understand the most. Nobody held a gun to my head. I chose this, every single day, for decades, because I believed the alternative was not merely a different life. I believed the alternative was annihilation, permanent, at Armageddon. An event I had been told my entire life was close enough that having children of my own felt almost like a controversial act of faith in a future I wasn't sure Jehovah intended anyone to have. The first crack did not come from a doubt about God. It came from a phone call in March, from my cousin Patricia, whom I had not spoken to in 9 years, because Patricia had been disfellowshipped in her 30s for what the Judicial Committee described only as conduct unbecoming a Christian, and once someone is disfellowshipped, the instruction to the rest of us is simple and absolute. Do not speak to them, not even to say hello in a grocery store, not even a nod, unless it is unavoidable family business. Patricia had defied that instruction to call me directly, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, my heart going so fast I thought Frank would hear it from the next room, because even answering felt like a sin I was actively committing in real time. Patricia did not ask me to leave. She did not accuse me of anything. She asked one single question, and then she let me hang up. She asked, "Denise, have you ever actually read what a courtroom in Australia found out about how our elders handled child abuse reports? Not what the Watchtower said about it afterward, what the court itself found." I told her I had no interest in apostate lies, and I hung up, and I told Frank about the call that same night, because we were taught that concealing contact, even unwanted contact, was itself a serious offense. Frank praised me for reporting it immediately. I remember feeling proud of myself. I also remember that I did not sleep that night, and that the questions sat in my chest like a stone for the next 4 months, refusing, for the first time in 53 years, to dissolve. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision matters when you are describing the unraveling of an entire worldview. It did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in a slow accumulation of small, specific facts I could no longer make disappear. The first fact came 4 months after Patricia's phone call, on a Tuesday evening in July, when my grandson Elias, who was 17 and living with us that summer while his parents dealt with a move, left his laptop open on the kitchen counter. I was not snooping. I want to say that clearly, because in the account I eventually gave the elders, that detail mattered enormously to them, as though the manner of discovery could somehow invalidate what was discovered. I was wiping down the counter, and the screen lit up under my hand, and there, in the open browser tab, was a scanned court document, a Royal Commission report from Australia, the same one Patricia had mentioned, the one I had refused to look at for 4 months. I sat down. I read it standing up first, then sitting down, because my knees genuinely would not hold me. It was not apostate rhetoric. It was sworn testimony, given under oath by an actual member of the governing body, describing under cross-examination the organization's internal policy requiring 2 witnesses to a single act of child sexual abuse before an accusation could be treated as established fact within the congregation, a policy drawn from an Old Testament legal standard designed for financial disputes between adults, applied instead to children reporting abuse that, by its very nature, almost never happens in front of a second witness. I read the testimony of a man, an elder for over 30 years, admitting on the record that internal documents relating to known abusers had been kept out of the hands of secular authorities for decades, protected under what the organization called clergy penitent privilege, even in jurisdictions with mandatory reporting laws. I read about a database, referred to informally as the list of those accused, that existed inside Watchtower headquarters, tracking men who had been credibly accused more than once, men who, in case after case documented in that report, were still permitted to serve in congregations, still permitted around children, because a second witness had never come forward. I want to tell you what happened in my body while I read this, because I think it matters more than what happened in my mind. My mind, for the first hour, tried very hard to do what it had been trained to do for 53 years, to find the frame that made this survivable, the explanation that would let me close the laptop and go back to believing what I had always believed. Persecution, I told myself. Apostates twisting testimony. The world hates Jehovah's people, and this is simply what that hatred looks like in a courtroom. But my body was not cooperating with my training. My hands were shaking. My chest had gone tight in a way I recognized from the 2 times in my life I had received genuinely catastrophic news. And somewhere underneath the trained reflex to disbelieve, a much older, much quieter part of me, the part that had been a mother for 30 years, the part that had once sat in a pediatrician's office memorizing the signs of exactly this kind of abuse in case anyone ever tried to hurt my own children, that part of me recognized, instantly and without any need for persuasion, that what I was reading was true. I read for 3 more hours that night. I read about the 1975 prediction, the one my own mother had told me about, the year the organization had strongly implied, in print, would bring the end of the present system of things. A prediction that led thousands of families to sell homes, delay having children, and abandon education, only for the date to pass with a quiet, retroactive reinterpretation that blamed the members themselves for having drawn conclusions the literature had, technically, never explicitly stated. I read the shifting definition of this generation, the term Jesus used regarding the timing of the end, reinterpreted by the governing body no fewer than 4 times across my own lifetime, each revision arriving with the same unwavering confidence as the version it replaced. I read about shunning as formal policy, not merely social discomfort but a written, structured practice, reaffirmed in Watchtower publications as recently as a few years earlier, describing family members as obligated to treat a disfellowshipped relative, even one living in the same house, as someone essentially dead to them spiritually, with narrow exceptions for unavoidable practicalities. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the 9 years of silence I had maintained toward a woman who, according to everything I was now reading, had likely done nothing more than ask questions very much like the ones now keeping me awake at my own kitchen table. By 4 in the morning, I understood something I did not want to understand. I understood that the fear I had felt every day of Ilias's laptop screen glowing in the dark was not the fear of losing my faith. It was the fear of, finally, after 53 years, being asked to look directly at something I had spent my entire life trained not to see. I did not tell Frank what I had read. I want to be honest about that, because it is the part of this story that still costs me something to say out loud. For 11 weeks, I lived 2 separate lives inside the same house. By day, I attended the Thursday meeting and the Sunday meeting. I sat beside my husband, an elder of 19 years, and I sang the songs, and I bowed my head for the prayers, and I nodded during the Watchtower study, and no one in that hall had any idea that I was, in the most literal sense, performing a role I no longer believed in. By night, after Frank had fallen asleep, I taught myself, for the first time in my life, how to research the way I had been warned my entire life never to research, by reading primary sources rather than the organization's summaries of them, by reading court transcripts rather than press releases responding to court transcripts, By cross-referencing dates in old Watchtower publications against the versions of history the organization now told about itself, I found, archived and scanned, a 1968 Awake article implying the end of the system of things could arrive by 1975. I found the organization's own later explanation, published after 1975 passed, placing responsibility for the disappointment not on the publication but on individual witnesses who had gone beyond what was written. I sat with that phrase for a long time. I thought about my mother, who had genuinely delayed having a third child because of that article, and who had spent the rest of her life never once hearing an apology for it, only being told, gently, that the fault had been hers for hoping to specifically. I found survivor accounts, dozens of them, from congregations across the country and abroad, describing nearly identical experiences to what I had read in the Australian report. Children who disclosed abuse to elders and were told to pray about it. Families instructed that reporting to police before consulting the congregation's legal department could itself be treated as a form of reproach against Jehovah's arrangement. Victims who were required, under the two-witness policy, to sit in the same kingdom hall as the men who had abused them, sometimes for years, because a second witness never materialized. An internal church discipline requires one. I found something else during those 11 weeks that I had not expected to find, which was myself. Not a new self, an old one, actually, a version of me that had existed briefly at 19. Before I married Frank, when I had once, quietly, wondered whether a college class in a subject that had nothing to do with religion might be interesting, and had been gently told by my mother that indulging that curiosity was a step toward the world, I had put that version of myself away so completely, for so long, that finding her again, at 53, sitting at my own kitchen table at 2 in the morning, with a legal document open on a borrowed laptop, felt less like a betrayal of my family, and more like meeting someone I had grieved without ever admitting I was grieving her. The turning point came, on a Thursday night, in October, at the Kingdom Hall, during a talk on the danger of what the speaker called independent thinking, a phrase used without irony, presented from the platform as a specific spiritual hazard. Something Jehovah's people needed to guard against, the way you would guard against a physical illness. The speaker quoted, approvingly, a decades-old Watchtower article, instructing readers that if the organization's teaching on a matter seemed to differ from personal interpretation of Scripture, the individual should defer to the organization, not the Scripture. I sat in the third row from the back, beside my husband, and I understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than anything I had read in 11 weeks of research, that I was being asked, publicly, in front of 200 people I had known my entire life, to actively distrust my own conscience in favor of an institution I now had overwhelming reason to believe had lied to me about matters of life and death, protected men who hurt children, and quietly rewritten its own prophetic failures, rather than ever once simply admitting to being wrong. I did not raise my hand during the comments that night, the way I usually would. I sat perfectly still, and somewhere in that stillness, without any dramatic internal announcement, I made the decision that would end my marriage, estrange me from my son, and cost me every friendship I had built over 5 decades. I decided I was done pretending. Leaving a religion you were born into is not like leaving a job or a city. There is no exit interview, no clean paperwork, no going away party. There is only a slow, deliberate process of making your unbelief visible to people who have spent your entire relationship believing your belief was the one stable thing about you. I started small, which in hindsight was itself a mistake, because small changes inside a closed system are noticed faster than large ones inside an open one. I stopped turning in my field service report card. Within 2 weeks, the elder assigned as our family's shepherding contact, a soft-spoken man I will call Elder Dawson, came to the house for what he described as an encouraging visit. He asked, gently, whether anything troubling had happened, whether I had encountered any material online that had disturbed me. I understand now that this was not an accident. Congregations are trained to identify exactly this pattern. A drop in meeting attendance or service activity is treated internally as an early warning sign requiring immediate, structured pastoral intervention, precisely because the organization understands, at an institutional level, how research tends to lead members toward the exit. I told Elder Dawson, carefully, that I had questions about the two-witness policy. I watched his face change in real time, from warmth to something more controlled, more careful. He told me the policy was scriptural, that it protected against false accusation, that the courts I had read about were biased against religious minorities and eager to extract damaging testimony for financial settlements. I asked him directly whether he believed a 7-year-old child should be required to produce a second witness before her report of abuse could be acted upon internally. He did not answer the question. He told me he would pray for me, and that he hoped I would return my full attention to Jehovah's organization before matters became more serious. I understood exactly what more serious meant. It meant a judicial committee. It meant 3 elders, behind a closed door, questioning me about the state of my faith, with the power to disfellowship me if they determined I had become, in the organization's language, an apostate, a designation reserved not merely for leaving quietly but for actively disagreeing with official teaching, one that carries the harshest shunning provisions of any disciplinary category in the entire structure. Frank found out 2 weeks later, not from me, but from Marissa, our daughter, who had noticed the search history on our shared home computer and, out of what she believed at the time was loyalty to the congregation, told her father. I remember the conversation that followed as the single worst evening of my adult life. Frank did not raise his voice. That was, somehow, worse than if he had. He sat across the kitchen table from me, the same table where I had spent 11 weeks reading in secret, and he asked me, very quietly, whether I understood what I was about to do to our family. I told him the truth. I told him about Patricia's phone call. I told him about the Australian court report. I told him about the 1975 article and the shifting generation teaching and the survivor accounts I had read. Dozens of them, all describing the same institutional pattern. I asked him to read even one of the source documents with me, just one, before deciding what he thought of me. He refused. He told me that reading apostate material was itself a serious spiritual danger, one he had been warned about specifically in his training as an elder, and that his refusal to read it was not closed-mindedness, but spiritual self-protection. The same caution he would exercise around anything designed, in his words, to look convincing. I understood, in that moment, that I was not simply losing an argument. I was watching, in real time, the mechanism that had kept me silent for 53 years operate flawlessly on someone I loved. Someone whose mind I had once believed was as sharp and independent as any I had ever known. He gave me 2 options that night, though he did not frame them as options. He told me I could speak to the elders myself, voluntarily, and perhaps demonstrate enough remorse to avoid formal discipline, or I could continue as I was, and the matter would be taken out of my hands. I chose neither option he offered me. I told him, as calmly as I could manage with my hands shaking under the table, that I was requesting to have my name removed from the congregation's membership records, a formal disassociation, on my own terms, in writing, rather than waiting to be judged by a committee for the crime of having finally read something for myself. The letter took me 3 days to write and 11 years to become capable of writing. I addressed it to the body of elders, and I kept it short, because I had learned enough by then to understand that anything I wrote could be read back to me later, in a judicial hearing, stripped of context, as evidence of apostate reasoning. I wrote only that I no longer believed the organization was what it claimed to be, that I no longer wished to be considered one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and that I was requesting disassociation rather than continued fellowship. I want to describe what disassociation means inside this system, because I did not fully understand it myself until I lived it. Unlike disfellowshipping, which involves a judicial process and a specific finding of wrongdoing, disassociation is treated, for shunning purposes, identically. The congregation announces it the same way, in the same flat institutional language, from the platform, without explanation. A member's name is simply read aloud as someone no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. From that point forward, every person in that congregation, people who had held my babies at their dedication talks, people who had brought me casseroles when I had surgery, people who had stood beside me at my own mother's memorial, was instructed to have no spiritual fellowship with me whatsoever. Frank moved out 3 weeks after the letter was read aloud. Not because I asked him to. He told me, without visible anger, that remaining married to a disassociated woman while continuing to serve as an elder was not sustainable, that the congregation would begin to question his own spiritual standing if he did not demonstrate appropriate distance. We are, technically, still legally married as I record this, because the organization does not require divorce, only what is termed marital shunning, no separate residence required by doctrine, only the withdrawal of ordinary affection and conversation. In practice, within 6 weeks, he had moved into his brother's spare room, and I have not had what I would call a real conversation with my husband of 31 years since the night I told him about Patricia's phone call. Marissa stopped answering my calls the week after the announcement. Trevor, my son, who had left the organization himself years earlier over an unrelated dispute and had already been shunned by everyone else in the family, was the only person who called me back. He told me something on that first phone call that I still think about almost every day. He said, "Mom, I know it feels like you lost everyone, but you didn't lose everyone. You lost the people who were only ever willing to know you as long as you agreed with them. That's not the same as losing everyone." I did not believe him at the time. I believe him now. The material cost was severe in ways I had not anticipated. At 53, having pioneered for 11 years and worked only part-time, low-wage jobs deliberately chosen to leave maximum hours for field service, I had almost no retirement savings, no established career, and a resume with a decades-long gap that no interviewer quite knew how to interpret. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, furnished mostly with donations from an online support community for people who had left high-control religious groups, a community I would not have believed existed 6 months earlier, made up of former witnesses, former members of other closed religious systems, and, strangely, a retired trauma therapist who had spent her career working specifically with people leaving groups like mine and who, for the first 4 months, counseled me for free. I grieved. I want to be honest that leaving was not liberation in the way people sometimes imagine it, a single triumphant door swinging open. It was closer to a slow-motion amputation, losing pieces of a life I had built for 53 years, one relationship at a time, while simultaneously discovering, for the first time as an adult, what it felt like to think a thought all the way to its end without checking first whether it was permitted. It has been 14 months since the letter was read aloud in that Kingdom Hall on Liberty Street. I want to tell you what I have built in that time, not because it erases what I lost, but because I think the people watching this who are still inside, still afraid, deserve to know what is actually on the other side of that door, rather than the version of it they have been warned about their entire lives. I enrolled in community college in the spring, in an introductory psychology course, the exact kind of worldly philosophy I had been warned against my entire life. I am 53 years old and I sat in a lecture hall beside 19-year-olds, and I took notes by hand because I still do not entirely trust myself, with a laptop in a classroom, and I earned a 94 on my first exam. And I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward and cried harder than I had cried since the day Frank moved out. Because no one in that lecture hall knew or cared that I had once believed pursuing an education was a form of spiritual failure. I found Patricia. I called her 9 years and 11 months after our last conversation, and she answered on the second ring, and the first thing she said to me, before hello, was, "It took you long enough. We have spoken almost every week since." She told me things that night I had never known. About her own judicial committee hearing years earlier. About a child abuse disclosure she had made to elders in her own congregation in her 20s that had been handled, almost identically to the pattern I had read about in that Australian report, with more concern for the accused man's standing than for what had happened to her. I joined a support group, initially online, then in person, made up entirely of women who had left this same organization, some of them decades ago, some of them, like me, only recently. We meet on Tuesday evenings in the community room of a public library, and there is no attendance sheet, no hour count, no card to fill out at the end of the meeting reporting how much time we spent there. I did not understand, until I sat in that circle for the first time, how much of my adult identity had been built around metrics I had never chosen and had never been permitted to question. I have not spoken to Frank in 5 months. I still love him, in the complicated way you love someone you've built an entire life alongside. Even after you understand that the life was built on a foundation neither of you had ever been allowed to inspect. Marissa sent me a single message on my birthday this year. 4 words, "Happy birthday. I hope you're well." And I have read those 4 words more times than I am willing to admit, searching them for a door that might still be open somewhere underneath the shunning she has been taught is spiritually required of her. I am not going to tell you this story ends in triumph, because that would not be honest, and I promised myself, the night I wrote that letter to the elders, that I would never again build my life around a story I had reason to believe was not entirely true. What I can tell you is that I sleep at night now. I can watch a documentary, read a news article, ask a question in a college seminar, without the specific, trained fear that curiosity itself is a sin. I talk to my son every week. I have a cousin back in my life who I nearly lost forever. I am building, slowly, at 53, the version of myself that existed briefly at 19 and then disappeared for 34 years. And I am doing it in the open, without a hallway I have to hide a laptop screen in. If you are still inside, and some part of what I have described tonight sounds familiar to you, the card at the end of the month, the two-witness policy, the fear of an article you have not yet let yourself finish reading. I am not going to tell you what to do. I spent 53 years being told what to do. What I will tell you is this: the question that finally freed me did not come from an enemy of my faith. It came from my own cousin, asking me, gently, to read something for myself, before deciding what I believed about it. I am asking you to do the same thing tonight, whatever that means for you. I think often about the night I sat at my kitchen table with Elias's laptop open in front of me, 4 in the morning, my whole body shaking, understanding for the first time in 53 years that the ground I had built my entire life on had never been as solid as I believed. I do not regret those 53 years the way I once thought I might. I raised 2 children inside that world who are, whatever else has happened between us, decent, thoughtful people. I built friendships that, even now severed by policy rather than by any personal failing, were real while they lasted. I do not believe every single person I knew inside that Kingdom Hall was acting in bad faith. I believe most of them were exactly what I had been: sincere, devoted, and never once given the tools to ask the questions that would have changed everything. What I regret is the 53 years I spent afraid of my own mind. I regret the version of myself that hung up the phone on Patricia and reported the call to my husband, like a good and faithful servant, proud of my own obedience, unaware that the very instinct I was praising myself for was the precise mechanism keeping me from a truth that had been available to me, in a courtroom transcript, for anyone willing to read it, for years before I finally did. I am 53 years old, and I am, for the first time since I was a very small child, thinking my own thoughts all the way to the end, without stopping to ask permission first. I do not know exactly what the rest of my life will look like. I know that Frank may never speak to me again in the way he once did. I know Marissa may take years to find her way back to me, if she ever does. But I know that whatever comes next, it will be mine, chosen with open eyes, and that after 53 years, that alone feels less like a loss and more like the first real beginning I have ever had.